Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Haynes. I'm an audiobook narrator, and I am delighted to introduce you to my narration teacher and a ridiculously accomplished narrator, Sean Pratt. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it.
Um, yeah, and so this, folks, is part of an interview series that I'm doing about professional narrators and accent work. So, Sean, a little bit of context in terms of your career as a narrator, and then we can dig into where accents came into it. But what do you think is easiest for people to know in terms of orienting themselves to who you are and what you do?
Um, okay, very quickly. I started acting when I was 10 in the theater in Oklahoma City at school with the local theater groups, and I did that all through school. I went off to Santa Fe, New Mexico to get my acting degree. And right out of college, I was working in movies in the area in the Southwest before I went to New York to be a classical theater actor. So from the age of 20 through about 40, I did classical theater off Broadway and in regional theaters around the country. And in the mid 90s, I relocated to uh, Washington, D.C. And through a friend of a friend, I was able to get into the world of audiobooks, which was a totally different industry at that time. So, as it relates to the topic of our discussion about accents, my exposure to them started back when I was 10 years old. So I've had a lot of experience in different contexts of theater, film, and now audiobooks, learning and performing accents.
Do you remember what sorts of things were going on when you were 10?
Oh, sure. You know, I have an older sister and a younger brother, and we had cousins who lived nearby, and we were absolutely addicted to those back in the day when they would put out the Walt Disney song version of a movie like Mary Poppins or bed knobs and broomsticks or whatever. We would play it and we would put on a little show. So we would mimic the song because we'd seen the movie. And so we would, and then of course you'd play the records incessantly and you'd begin to pick up that sound. And it was my very first exposure to the concept of an accent. And I've always, as you know, as my student, I said that a good performer is a good mimic, and a good mimic is a good observer. And so, starting from when I was around 10 or 11, I would listen to the way people would speak on those records and then mimic it. And of course, the joke is, I learned how to speak my British accent initially from Dick Van Dyke and Mary Poppins, which is say no more, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, you learn, you mimic what you hear, and then working in the theater, when I would be around the older actors who could do a lot more, I would just listen. I was constantly paying attention and then playing it back in my head and speaking it. It all came organically for me.
I find that when I take on a project, a passion, something that I'm going to be invested in for years,
Hmm.
as I take on a vocation, I find that I discover two things. One is what my superpower is within that, and one is what my kryptonite is within that thing. Do you find that you're able to recognize a superpower and a kryptonite that you have when it comes to accent work or even just audiobook work?
Well, so the two are slightly different. In audiobook work, my superpower is my ability to live within the nonfiction category, which is my specialty as a narrator now. I say that a great fiction narrator has an ear for dialogue, and a great nonfiction narrator has an ear for monologue, because that's
Mm,
what through
mm.
my, in my own performance, when we work together about how to turn a nonfiction piece into a monologue. So it's a one person play, as it were.
Mhm.
Um, and there have been cases within nonfiction where I've used accents too, which we can talk about. Um, but as far as and in fiction, I know that one of my strengths is my ability to do dialogue very well, and that's just from years of being in the theater and film. I feel my dialogue is very good. It flows very naturally. far as kryptonite goes, I I think it's more about genre. I think one of my kryptonites is I'm not a real fan of like romance generally, of whatever stripe it comes in. I've done kinds of romance stuff from sweet Christian romance all the way over to nasty erotica, and every time I'm done with it, I'm just like, ugh. So it's more a matter of reaction to the genre. I just don't. It doesn't really work for me. Um, and then uh, I guess a general kryptonite is that when you just have to work overtime to make a poorly written piece work for the listener, you know, because a really good narrator can tell a great story even if the author didn't write one, but it's not easy. And so, that can be a kryptonite too if you're working with sort of, shall we generously say, mediocre material. That can really present a challenge.
Hmm.
And then that also presents a challenge in the way, going back to accents, how you perform them. So I just, as we were saying before we started this, I just finished recording The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner for a client. And it's a lot of stream of consciousness. Of the four chapters, three of them are done in stream of consciousness. So it's rather tricky. It's like when I recorded Infinite Jest, a lot of flow in that, took a lot of concentration and a lot of prep of the script. But what Faulkner did at the time was he had all the African American characters. He wrote out their lines of dialogue in their own patois, right? But it was so hard to decipher because he's trying to type in what the accent he thinks sounds like when you put it on paper. And if you've ever had to narrate a piece that's written in the actual accent, it's very difficult to get a sense of flow because you can't read ahead. You're reading someone's odd, writing. I'm Gwen Tware heard in front of, but it doesn't flow as well. So those sections of the book were quite challenging to do. And also, frankly, given where it takes place in Mississippi, I don't think he typed some of those accents out correctly, having worked in Mississippi several times. But
Uh-huh.
that's my own take on it. So yeah, that was so that could be a kryptonite too, when the author decides to write out an accent or dialect in the text itself, as opposed to saying they speak in this dialect. That gives me, that's a different way of approaching the text. It's hard to explain to some people if you've never had to confront something like that.
Yeah, yeah. Um, what was when you're faced with a text that is not written phonetically, but is calling for an accent, and maybe an accent that you haven't touched on in a while, or maybe haven't touched on at all? What are some of the first things that you think about as you ground yourself for the work ahead?
So when I'm prepping a book, so this would be fiction. I've only done accent work in nonfiction very rarely, but I have done it on occasion. But in either case, depending on what the accent is, I have to make a call to begin with about how much do I want to acknowledge the accent? Um, One of my own rules as a performer is when I'm doing character voices generally, the more fantastical the genre, the more license I have to have more fantastical voices. So if I'm doing fantasy or science fiction, or a specific genre like a Western, then I have more license to go broader in the accent. If it's more a matter of um, like a modern drama or something like that, I look at what the description says, and then I have to decide how far I want to go with that accent. And then, frankly, how how far in the sense of for the audience's ear. Always remember, you're performing for an American audience. And to an American, the difference between a South African accent and maybe an Australian accent is very close. And if you can get one, you can more or less get the other. But then you also have circumstances within the text, which is why prepping a book is important. Oftentimes, when someone, let's say, moves from somewhere else in the world to here, oftentimes that person will try very hard to have no accent or have a very, very light accent. All right. Um, I'm from Oklahoma, but you wouldn't know that to hear me speak now. But when I go home to visit my extended family there, to fit in, I will, reacquire my accent so I fit in. So that's an artistic call you have to make. Because so now just because it says someone's from South Africa doesn't mean they have to sound South African. They have to have a really thick accent. It could be just one or two little things that just give a hint of the accent. So it's very circumstantial. So when I'm prepping a book, I'm making those kinds of calls, and I have conversations with the author too, and when I can, depending on the schedule and the author. Um, and then I come up with something that's workable. There are also times when I realize that the accent isn't really about the character, or it's not going to drive the scene. And so I do something that I Scott Brick my accents. My friend Scott Brick uh, does almost nothing with character voices, and yet you always know who's speaking
Hmm.
because he plays the line, he plays the intention. And so sometimes I'll have a student come to me, worried about, learning an accent that's really hard for them. I'm like, look, just Scott Brick it, and you'll be fine. And it'll be fine because ultimately, it's not the book, the performance, and the entertainment quality is not about the accent. The accent is something you add into it, right? The
Hmm.
story doesn't turn on how well I can do an Irish accent or a
Hmm.
Canadian accent. It turns on the plot and the characters, you know. Um, but to go back to your question, if I have a character that's the main narrative voice, if it's in an accent I have never worked on or know a little bit, I go back to my theater training and I'll go back and I'll go to YouTube and I'll listen to how do local newscasters speak in that accent.
Hmm.
I'll listen to actors who are from that area if they're on YouTube, or maybe there is a podcast I can listen to. We all think it's so funny. A lot of America, we think only podcasts happen in England and America. They happen everywhere. So if you just do a little digging, you can find a South African podcast if you wanted to,
Yeah.
and just listen to them. And then that's when you're listening, you're observing,
Hmm.
and that's when the mimicking happens.
Yeah.
So I did. It's like when you listen to one of your favorite songs. You're mimicking the style the singer is singing in, right? So
Right.
I listen to it and I mimic it. And then in that transition, you start to latch on to one or two important vocal affects of that maybe the melody, the rhythm, the tempo, vowel placement. You just need a couple of things that hang your hat on. So they go, oh, he's from South Africa, he's from Canada, he's from whatever.
Yeah.
And that's how I start and focus on it. I start by listening.
So I gotta ask, and because one of my more popular and controversial videos is where I take on the Down East Maine accent. And my first mistake was I framed it as the Maine accent. I got a lot of blowback on that, which is okay, because I learned something and it drove my views up. But it was probably about 25% gripe on how Hollywood gets it wrong.
Right.
And so you come from you've put down roots and had roots in a few places in the United States. Um, Oklahoma, New York. You've spent some significant time in England.
Yeah, and Santa Fe, New Mexico, the Washington D.C. Chesapeake area.
What
They're
is
all different
your
towns.
what is your Hollywood should have hired me favorite in terms of things about one of those places that people almost always get wrong?
Oh boy. Here's the thing. They always get it wrong, but they do try to get it right.
Hmm.
So like the musical Hairspray. Remember that? About
Hmm.
10, 20 years ago? Okay, so John Travolta is in that piece, right? And he really tried to get the Baltimore Hun accent. He worked really hard on it, and he gave it a credible thing. And to me, it points up the challenge of any actor in a movie or book or play is that you're trying to give enough of the accent so that a, someone who's not from the area goes, oh yeah, that's where. Oh yeah, I know. I heard the guy. Like, oh, he's from the. Okay, got it.
Hmm.
Knowing full well that you will never get it correct for the locals from their perspective. You
Hmm.
will never get it fully correct unless that's the only accent you do full time. In other words, if I'm doing the Beans of Egypt, Maine, is that right? The Beans of Egypt, Maine. That's a very
Yeah.
famous book. Okay, um, if you're and if if I was going to do the movie, yeah, you have a vocal coach and you work, but it's just that it's almost like an uncanny valley. You're almost right.
Mm.
But for everybody else in the United States, they'll go, "Oh yeah, sounds like Stephen King. Yeah, okay." You
Yeah.
know, they
Yeah.
sound so there's a no-win situation happening where no matter how hard you study an accent, it is. No, I'm not having done, tons and tons of okay, so I did an Agatha Christie book,
Uh-huh.
Hercule Poirot. So he's from Belgium, so basically he's French. I had different types of Brits, different kinds of some people from France, and of course there were a couple of Americans from the 1930s. So they sort of had that kind of sound here you always hear in those movies, from the 30s. And was my French accent perfect? No. But from a listener's perspective, it was good enough to tell the story.
Hmm.
So what happens to me is like, I mean, I'll have to go back and watch that video now that you did on the main accent. You were trying to get it as good as possible.
Uh-huh.
And if I heard you in the book from being from Oklahoma, I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds what people. Yeah, that works for me. But if you're from Maine, it will never be good enough because
Hmm.
you're going to miss those little nuances that are so subtle. Once again, like the British accents.
Hmm.
I've been going back and forth to Britain now for 8 years now, 7 years. And I've got, you hear the vowels, you hear the rhythm, but all it takes is one little melody slightly off, and someone from Cornwall goes, ah, he's not from Cornwall. Never
Right.
say that.
Right.
So it's a no-win situation. And so to me, what the audience I'm actually playing for are not the locals. I'm
Hmm.
playing for everybody else. And it has to be good enough that they go, that's what that sounds like.
You know, what you're talking about does reminds me of something that David Mamet said about writing dialect from a certain region. He said, if I write it, whatever I choose to write, if it's consistent with the character, then people who listen to it are going to believe that you know the characters talk like that in that area. People are going to be actually looking for the character's voice in that area as opposed to looking for
Mhm.
that area in the character. Another example that I can give are like Al Pacino's Scarface and Robert Carlyle's performance in Jaws, where it's like, wow, I can't think of anyone I've heard from that area who talks like that. But boy, if that character that they committed to got in my face and said, "I dare you to accuse me of being inauthentic," I'd be like, "No,
Right.
no, no,
No, no. Yeah, well, and that's the thing too, is that even within regions, okay, so, let's say Oklahoma. I my mother has a really funny Oklahoma accent. Very twangy, very nasally. My brother-in-law has this sort of down home kind of, but then I have my niece and nephew have hardly any accent. It has to do with everything from age, ethnicity, where you grew up in the state, education level, what do you do for a living, so you can have variations of accent within an area, a state.
Mhm.
Once again, though, to me, it's about you're right. It's like the accent it helps augment the character, but it is not the character. And that a lot of I remember when I was a young actor, I made that mistake when I was a kid and a teenager, thinking the whole accent or the whole character's in the accent. It's like the actor who chews gum as a character choice. You
Mhm.
know, it's like no, that's just something. That's not the whole thing. My accent isn't the essence of the character. It's part of it.
Mhm.
Um, and once again, if you just, you're listening for that sound to try to get it close enough, knowing full well you won't get it all the way. It's like when we speak in foreign languages in audiobooks, you know. if you recall, when we were working together, we had the lesson on foreign languages, and that when we are doing fiction, you're trying to sound like, yeah, oh, they speak with a German accent. And then sometimes in the fiction piece, that German character might speak in German. And so you're trying to sound like a native speaker for an American audience from their perspective, knowing full well that you don't sound like a real German,
Right, right.
right? And also in nonfiction, that's why 99% of the time we anglicize all foreign pronunciations because there's just no way to, you're not going to please anybody by trying to speak a language you don't know like a native speaker. It's impossible.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so I'm sorry, we've drifted away from the question.
No, no,
Sorry.
no, no. I think we're in there. I mean, what I'm hearing is a thread that I didn't expect to pop up is what I'm imagining, one of just relaxation and familiarization. When what I'm hearing when you're talking about the mimicry is just having lots of time to spend with the accent and with the words. Not just looking up like a quick how-to video on YouTube. God help people who put those out. But listening to maybe taking cues from that, but also just really getting to know the folks, really getting to get familiar with them. Familiarization is what might turn a local off from an accent because they've gotten so familiar with it that somebody else's job of it is going to sound not perfect to them. And
Yeah.
also just the relaxation that the listener needs to engage with the story. They don't want to hear somebody straining for the authentic accent. They want to hear somebody who is just comfortably working within characteristics of which the accent is a part, and in the meantime, just easing into the story. Um,
There's an,
yeah.
there's another thing that you can do. There's a cheat code that I came up with once again as the theater in the theater, and I've used it on occasion throughout my entire career. And that is, um, depending on the time and challenge of the accent. So let's say South African is a very tricky accent for me to do.
Mm,
So let's say I'm doing a book that's got a character from South Africa. Um, if I have the time, I will gather up all of their lines and highlight them in the text. I will find someone from South Africa and I will hire them to say those lines for me
mhm,
so I can actually hear, and if I can, it'll be an actor, right? And I'll say, here's the scene, and I'll work with them and I'll record it. And then I basically I'm hearing it and then I'm mimicking it in my own, acting choice, but I'm hearing the words. It's like, as you know, when we get pickups on a piece of fiction, okay? They'll have the line that you missed and the audio sample that it came from. So
yeah.
you listen to the sample and you go, oh, yeah, that's when she's really angry. Got it. So you know the intention of the line. Now you just have to say it again with the correct word that you missed. It's sort of like that. You hear it and you mimic it. You hear it and you mimic it. So on occasion, if I have a very difficult one, and I learned this, like I said, in the theater, um, what was the accent I was trying to mimic? I'm trying to think now. I think it was a I think it was a German accent in a play. I was a teenager. Anyway, I had all my lines and I went through a friend and I found someone who was German to say them in a German American accent. And that's how I learned to say those lines. So I was just mimicking what they said. And as long as I got that right, I knew I could do the rest of it right. So that's a little cheat code that I came up with a long, long time ago. And that can go for regional accents within like within the United States, let's say. So if
Mhm.
I don't know how to do a Maine accent. Okay. But if I got a book tomorrow that had one, that had a character or characters, I might hire someone to read portions of it so I begin to hear the rhythm of it. And then I can, so that I'm going right to the source,
Yeah.
which is akin to going to YouTube, but this is a little more personal because I'm asking them to say the actual line for me and give me a line reading that I can then tweak when I need to. But I hear the rhythm and the vowels, the enunciation. It's a great, if you've got the time, it's a great little cheat code.
And this element of scholarship, as we wrap up, uh, reminds me to give a shout out to your work as a teacher. And folks, I studied with Sean for about a year and a quarter. He does how many 14 sessions, right?
14. Yep.
14 sessions. And I there was times when I needed to miss a month or two, and but Sean just patiently kept at it with me, and it was game changing for me in terms of what I now bring to narration, and hopefully it's subtle enough so that you folks who've been listening to my work from the beginning aren't going to, see have an ear sore listening to my earlier work. But it's just taken me to a whole new level in terms of what I do within the genres that I've been doing since the beginning, and also the genres that I now embrace. Sean, where can people, and I'll put this in the video description as well, but where can people go to learn more about your work as a teacher, presuming you aren't booked for the next 10 years?
Well, I'm not booked for the next 10 years. Uh, they can go to seanprattpresents.com. There's a section in there on my coaching. You can read about it. And I offer a free consultation where I explain what it is I do and how I do it. So you just have to send me an email at seanpratt@comcast.net. And then I'll set up the consultation. I'll send you some materials to look over. I do my little spiel, answer any of your questions. Um, I'm very low. It's not a sign up today and get two, buy one, get one free. It's a very relaxed kind of atmosphere. But every time we meet, we have a lesson in the audiobook industry, so business,
Yes.
and then a lesson in narration technique, and they go together because my job is to make sure my students know how to do this for a living and to make money and do it, to fulfill their career aspirations. But yes, seanprattpresents.com.
Wonderful. Hello, everybody. Mr. Sean Pratt, also known as the ginger-haired Yoda, which you can see over his shoulder to
Oh
the left.
yeah. Oh, here he is. Yes.
Yep. And I've actually got my graduation certificate right here.
Suitable for framing. Yes.
Yes, and I will be framing it soon. Um, but thank you so much, Sean. So this is Sean Pratt. I'm Matt Haynes. I hope that our voices and your ears meet again real soon.
Bye bye, everybody.